The Doberman's teeth were bared, blood dripping from its muzzle, when Elena first saw it cornered in the alley behind her apartment building. Three men in expensive suits surrounded the animal, their guns drawn, voices sharp with commands the dog refused to obey. She should have walked away. Any sane person would have. But Elena Martinez had never been good at ignoring things that were suffering. And the way that dog's eyes locked onto hers, not with aggression, but with something that looked almost like pleading, made the decision for her before her brain could catch up. She stepped into the alley. The rain was coming down hard enough to sting, soaking through her scrubs from her double shift at the veterinary clinic. One of the men turned, his hand moving to his weapon, but she raised both hands and kept walking forward, slow and steady, the way you approach any frightened animal. "Don't shoot him," she said, her voice somehow calm despite the fact that her heart was trying to punch through her ribcage. "He's injured! Look at him! He's terrified!" The tallest man, the one who seemed to be in charge, lowered his gun slightly. His eyes swept over her, taking in the clinic scrubs, the name tag that read, Elena Martinez, DVM Tech, the fact that she was alone and unarmed and either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. "Lady, you need to step back," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he wasn't used to being questioned. "This animal is dangerous. It belongs to someone you don't want to meet." Elena ignored him. She was already kneeling, extending her hand toward the Doberman, letting it catch her scent. The dog's ears flicked forward, confusion replacing some of the fear in those dark, intelligent eyes. Up close, she could see the extent of the damage, deep lacerations across the shoulders, a gash along the ribs that looked infected, patches of fur missing where something or someone had torn into the animal with deliberate cruelty. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, and the Doberman's tail gave a single, hesitant wag. Behind her, she heard the men conferring in low voices, phones being pulled out, calls being made. She didn't care. Her entire world had narrowed to this dog, to the way it was trembling despite its size and obvious training, to the way it leaned into her touch when she carefully ran her fingers along its neck, checking for a collar. There wasn't one. Just scars, old ones and new ones, layered like a map of pain. "I'm taking him," Elena said, standing up and turning to face the three men. Rain ran down her face, plastered her dark hair to her skull, but she met their eyes without flinching. "If you want to stop me, you'll have to shoot me too. And I don't think your boss wants that kind of attention in a residential neighborhood." It was a bluff, a desperate, stupid bluff. But something in her tone, or maybe the sheer audacity of it, made the lead man hesitate. He exchanged glances with his companions, then spoke into his phone in rapid Italian. Elena didn't speak Italian, but she understood the tone. He was asking for instructions. After a moment, he lowered the phone and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between respect and pity. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said quietly. "But it's your funeral. Take the dog. When he comes for it, and he will, don't say we didn't warn you." Elena didn't wait for them to change their minds. She stripped off her jacket and used it to fashion a makeshift muzzle, more for the dog's protection than hers. The Doberman allowed it, too exhausted and hurt to resist. She got one arm under its chest, the other supporting its hindquarters, and half-carried, half-dragged 60 pounds of injured animal out of that alley and into her building. Her apartment was on the third floor. No elevator. By the time she got the dog inside, her arms were screaming and her scrubs were soaked with a mixture of rain and blood that she hoped was all canine. She laid the Doberman down on her bathroom floor, the only room with tile that she could properly disinfect later, and got to work. This was what she knew. This was what she was good at. Not the politics of her job at the clinic, not the social graces that seemed to come so easily to everyone else, but this, the quiet, methodical work of healing. She cleaned each wound with careful precision, administered antibiotics from her personal emergency kit, stitched the worst of the lacerations with hands that had steadied the moment they had something useful to do. The dog watched her the entire time, those dark eyes tracking her every movement, but it never once tried to bite, never growled, just lay there with a kind of stoic patience that broke her heart, like it had been through this before, like it knew the routine of being hurt and being fixed. "You're safe now," Elena murmured as she worked, knowing it was probably a lie, knowing that the men in that alley would tell their boss and their boss would come, but needing to say it anyway. "No one's gonna hurt you here. I promise." She had no idea how dangerous a promise that would turn out to be. By the time she finished, it was past midnight. The dog was sleeping, its breathing steady and even, the worst of the crisis passed. Elena slumped against the bathroom wall, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. She should sleep. She had another shift in 6 hours. But her mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment in the alley, the look in those men's eyes, the words that kept echoing in her head. When he comes for it, and he will. Who was he? And what kind of man owned a dog that had been hurt this badly? The answer, when it came 3 days later, would be worse than anything she could have imagined. If you're already hooked by Elena's choice and want to see what happens when two worlds collide, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story is about to get dangerous. Also, if you want to support the channel and help us keep bringing you compelling stories like this, there's a link in the description where you can buy us a cup of coffee. Every bit helps us create better content for you. Now back to the story. The Doberman, which Elena had started calling Shadow for the way it seemed to melt into the dark corners of her apartment, healed faster than any animal she'd ever treated. Within 48 hours, it was eating properly, moving without the painful limp that had characterized those first hours. Within 72, it was following her from room to room with the devotion of a creature that had found something it hadn't known it was missing. Elena tried not to get attached. She knew she couldn't keep the dog permanently. Someone owned this animal, had trained it, and despite the abuse it had clearly suffered, there might be legal ramifications to just taking it. She'd been checking the online lost pet databases, had called the local shelters to report finding a stray, had done everything by the book. What she hadn't done was report the men with guns in the alley. That felt like a line she wasn't ready to cross, a door she didn't want to open. So she waited, and she watched, and she told herself that if no one claimed Shadow within 2 weeks, she'd start the formal adoption process. She made it 5 days. It was a Tuesday evening, and Elena had just gotten home from work, was still in her scrubs with her keys in her hand when she noticed the silence. Her building was never silent. Mrs. Chen on the second floor always had her TV too loud. The Martinez family, no relation, had 3 kids under 5 who treated the hallways like a playground. But tonight, nothing. Just a thick, heavy quiet that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Shadow was at the door before she got it fully open, a low growl rumbling in its chest, ears pinned back, every muscle tensed. Elena's hand went to the dog's collar, a new one she'd bought on her lunch break, bright blue with a tag that had her phone number on it. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, and then she saw them. 4 black SUVs parked in a perfect line across the street. Tinted windows, engines running, the kind of vehicles that screamed money and power and don't ask questions. As she watched, doors opened in synchronized precision, and men stepped out. Lots of men, dressed in black suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of military training or something worse. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They simply walked toward her building with the inevitability of a storm front, and Elena knew, with a sick certainty that dropped into her stomach like a stone, exactly who they were here for. She had maybe 2 minutes. Maybe. Elena pulled Shadow inside, locked the door, threw the deadbolt, dragged her ancient couch across the entrance for good measure. It wouldn't stop them. Nothing would stop them. But it might buy her seconds, and seconds might be enough to think. Her phone was in her hand before she'd consciously decided to grab it. 911. She should call 911. But what would she say? Men in suits are outside my building and I think they want the dog I stole from them? The police would either laugh or arrest her. And she had a feeling these men wouldn't wait around for law enforcement to sort out the details. Shadow was pacing now, that low growl never stopping. And Elena realized with a start that the dog wasn't afraid. It was protective. It had positioned itself between her and the door, hackles raised, teeth bared, ready to fight whatever came through that entrance. No, she said firmly, crouching down to grab the dog's face in both hands, forcing it to look at her. No, Shadow. These are your people, remember? They're here to take you home. You're supposed to want this. But the Doberman just pressed closer to her legs, trembling not with fear but with barely contained aggression, and Elena felt something crack open in her chest. This dog didn't want to go back. Whatever home meant in its previous life, it wasn't somewhere safe. It wasn't somewhere good. The knock, when it came, was almost polite. 3 sharp raps, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that suggested the person on the other side had all the time in the world and knew you weren't going anywhere. Miss Martinez. The voice was male, accented, cultured, not what she'd expected. My name is Luca Vitale. I'm here on behalf of my employer to retrieve his property. Please open the door. We'd very much like to resolve this situation peacefully. Peacefully. The word hung in the air like a threat wrapped in silk. Elena's voice, when she found it, came out steadier than she felt. The dog was injured, abandoned. I found it in an alley and provided medical treatment. If your employer wants to file a claim, he can contact me through proper legal channels. There was a pause. Then, impossibly, she heard laughter. Low and rich and genuinely amused. Miss Martinez, I don't think you understand the situation. My employer doesn't do legal channels. He does results. Now, I'm a reasonable man, and I can see you've taken good care of Cerberus. Cerberus? Elena interrupted, the name sending a chill down her spine. The 3-headed dog that guarded the gates of hell in Greek mythology. What kind of person named their dog that? Yes, Cerberus. And while my employer appreciates your veterinary skills, he's quite anxious to have his companion returned. So I'm going to count to 10, and then we're coming in whether you open the door or not. I'd prefer not to damage your property, but that's entirely up to you. He started counting. Slow, measured, each number another second of her old life ticking away. 1. Elena looked at Shadow, at Cerberus, at this animal that had been named after a monster but had shown her nothing but gentle trust. 2. She thought about the scars, the fear in the alley, the way the dog had leaned into her touch like it had been starving for kindness. 3. She made a decision that would change everything. 4. Elena pulled the couch away from the door, flipped the deadbolt, and opened it wide. But she didn't step back. She stood in the entrance with Cerberus pressed against her legs, and she looked Luca Vitale directly in the eyes. You can tell your employer, she said clearly, that if he wants his dog back, he's going to have to come here himself and explain to me face to face how an animal ends up this badly hurt under his care. Otherwise, Cerberus stays with me. The hallway had gone very, very still. Luca Vitale was a handsome man in his 40s, silver threading through dark hair, the kind of face that probably smiled easily under normal circumstances. But there was nothing easy about his expression now. He looked at her like she'd just announced she was planning to walk into traffic, a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. "Miss Martinez," he said softly, "do you have any idea who you're talking about?" "No," Elena said, "and I don't care. This dog was hurt. Badly. And until someone explains to me how that happened and guarantees it won't happen again, he's staying here. Those are my terms." Behind Luca, the other men had tensed, hands moving toward weapons she couldn't see but knew were there. The air itself felt dangerous, like reality had thinned to something that could tear at any moment. Then Luca did something unexpected. He smiled. Really smiled, like she'd delighted him in some fundamental way. "You have courage, Miss Martinez. Stupidity, too, but definitely courage." He pulled out his phone, typed something quickly, then looked back at her. "My employer will be here in 20 minutes. I suggest you use that. Time to reconsider your position. When Dante Caruso wants something, he gets it. The only variable is how much blood gets spilled in the process." He turned and walked away, the other men following, leaving Elena standing in her doorway with a dog named after a hellhound, and 20 minutes to figure out if she'd just made the bravest or stupidest decision of her life. Probably both. The first thing Elena noticed when Dante Caruso walked into her apartment was the silence that preceded him. Not the absence of sound, but the quality of it. The way her neighbor's TV cut off mid-sentence, the way the kids stopped screaming in the hallway, the way even the traffic noise from the street seemed to hush, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The second thing she noticed was that he was younger than she'd expected. Mid-30s maybe, with the kind of face that classical sculptors would have fought over. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, dark eyes that held an intelligence that was somehow more frightening than raw aggression would have been. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than her car, and he moved through her cramped apartment like a panther exploring new territory, completely at ease and utterly in control. Cerberus, who had been a coiled spring of tension for the past 20 minutes, went absolutely still. Not relaxed. Still. The way prey freezes when a predator enters the room, every instinct screaming danger, but knowing that running would only trigger the chase. Dante looked at the dog, then at Elena, then back at the dog. Something flickered across his face too fast for her to name, but when he spoke, his voice was surprisingly soft, almost gentle. "Cerberus, vieni qui. Come here." Even Elena's limited Italian could translate that. But the dog didn't move. It pressed closer to her legs, a low whine escaping its throat, and Elena felt her heart break a little at the sound. This was fear. Real, bone-deep fear. Not of being hurt, but of being taken back to the place where hurt was normal. Dante's expression shifted, something dark passing through his eyes. He took a step forward, and Elena moved without thinking, putting herself between the man and the dog. Her hands spread in a gesture that was half plea, half defense. "Don't," she said, "please, he's terrified." "He's been trained since he was 8 weeks old," Dante replied, his voice still soft but with an edge now, like silk over steel. "He doesn't get terrified. He gets aggressive, he gets focused, he gets lethal when I tell him to be. But he doesn't get terrified." "Then you haven't been paying attention," Elena shot back and immediately regretted it when those dark eyes focused on her with the intensity of a surgical laser. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean... Look, I'm not trying to keep your dog. I just want to understand what happened to him. No animal ends up this traumatized without a reason." Dante moved again, faster this time, and suddenly he was close enough that Elena could smell his cologne. Something expensive and subtle that made her think of dark wood and dangerous promises. He reached past her, not touching, just extending his hand toward Cerberus, and she watched the war play out across the dog's face. Obedience versus fear. Training versus trauma. Obedience won, barely. Cerberus crept forward, head low, tail tucked, and allowed Dante's hand to rest on its head. But the trembling didn't stop, and after a moment, Dante pulled back, his jaw tight with something that might have been anger or might have been something more complicated. 3 weeks ago, he said, not looking at Elena, his eyes still on the dog, Cerberus was taken, stolen from my estate by people who wanted to send me a message. They had him for 5 days before my men tracked him down. By the time we found where they'd been keeping him, the place was empty except for blood and evidence of what they'd done to him. We spent 2 weeks searching every animal shelter, every veterinary clinic, every goddamn alley in this city. And then Luca tells me some woman in scrubs pulled a gun on my men and took him. I didn't pull a gun, Elena protested. You stepped between armed men and an injured animal with nothing but audacity and a veterinary degree, Dante interrupted, finally looking at her. And the weight of his attention was like standing in front of a bonfire. Do you know how many people in this city would do that? None. 0. People see my men, they walk the other way. But you walked toward them. There was something in his voice that Elena couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not even annoyance. More like fascination, the way a scientist might look at a specimen that defied all known laws of physics. He was hurt, she said simply. I couldn't just leave him there. No, Dante agreed, and a smile ghosted across his lips. There and gone so fast she almost missed it. I don't suppose you could. He moved then, a smooth, economical motion that had him sitting on her secondhand couch without asking permission, looking completely at ease despite the fact that his knees probably cost more than everything in her apartment combined. Cerberus, released from the weight of his attention, immediately retreated to Elena's side, pressing against her legs hard enough that she had to brace herself to stay upright. Dante noticed. Of course he noticed. Those dark eyes missed nothing. He trusts you, he said, and there was something in his tone that sounded almost like wonder. In less than a week, you've earned more trust from that animal than most people earn in a lifetime. How? Elena shrugged, uncomfortable with the intensity of his focus. I didn't hurt him. That's a pretty low bar. In my world, Miss Martinez, not hurting something when you have the power to do so is practically a revolutionary act. Dante leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and Elena had the sudden, unsettling feeling of being hunted. Let me tell you what's going to happen now. I could take Cerberus by force. 5 of my men are standing in the hallway, and while I appreciate your courage, you're 120 pounds soaking wet, and they're trained professionals. I could walk out of here with my dog in the next 60 seconds, and the only thing you could do about it is file a police report that would go absolutely nowhere. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. But you're not going to do that. No, Dante agreed. I'm not. Because taking him by force would undo the fragile trust you've somehow managed to build. And that trust is the only thing standing between Cerberus and a complete psychological break. Those men who took him, they didn't just hurt him physically. They tried to break him mentally. They failed, but it was close. Too close. And now I'm watching him choose you over me. Over his training, over every instinct I spent 3 years drilling into him, and I'm realizing something interesting. What's that? Elena asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Dante's smile this time was sharp enough to cut. That I don't give things up just because someone else wants them. Cerberus is mine. But you've become important to his recovery, which means you've become important to me. So here's what we're going to do. You're going to keep Cerberus here, continue his treatment, and I'm going to compensate you for your time and expertise. Call it a consultant fee. I don't want your money, Elena said automatically. And Dante laughed, a real laugh that transformed his face from dangerously beautiful to something that made her stomach do a complicated flip. Everyone wants my money, Miss Martinez. They just don't always admit it. He stood, and suddenly her small apartment felt even smaller, the air thinner. But fine. No money. Instead, you owe me a debt. You took something of mine, you fixed it, and now I'm allowing you to keep it temporarily. That creates an obligation, and I always collect on my debts. There was a warning in those words, clear as a bell. Elena heard it, understood it, and knew she should back down, apologize, hand over the dog, and go back to her quiet life. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, what kind of debt? Dante moved toward the door, Luca materializing from the hallway to open it for him. But before he left, he turned back, and the look he gave Elena was complex enough that she couldn't begin to unpack it. I haven't decided yet, he said softly. But I'll let you know. Take good care of Cerberus, Miss Martinez. I'll be checking in. Regularly. And then he was gone, and Elena was left standing in her apartment with a dog that had stopped trembling and 20 new questions for every one that had been answered. She didn't know it yet, but Dante Caruso never did anything without a reason. And the debt he'd just claimed wasn't about the dog at all. It was about the woman who'd been brave enough or foolish enough to think she could save something from his world and walk away unchanged. He was about to teach her exactly how wrong that assumption was. The first gift arrived the next morning. Elena found it on her doorstep when she left for work. A basket filled with premium dog food, veterinary-grade supplements, and a leather collar that probably cost more than her monthly grocery budget. No note, no explanation. Just the clear message that Dante Caruso knew where she lived, knew her schedule, and wanted her to know he was watching. The second gift came 3 days later. This time it was for her. A top-of-the-line espresso machine, the kind she'd lingered over in Williams-Sonoma but would never buy for herself. Delivered to her apartment by men in suits who set it up on her counter without asking permission, and left before she could protest. The pattern continued. Dog toys that Cerberus ignored, but that must have cost hundreds of dollars. A set of scrubs in her exact size, designer brand, with her name embroidered on the pocket. A new deadbolt for her door, installed by a locksmith who appeared one afternoon while she was at work, along with a security camera system that she definitely hadn't authorized. Elena wanted to be angry. She should have been angry. This was an invasion of privacy, a display of power meant to remind her that she existed in Dante Caruso's world now, whether she liked it or not. But underneath the anger was something more complicated. An awareness that every gift was carefully chosen, that someone was paying attention not just to what she needed, but to what she wanted. That someone saw her. It had been a long time since anyone had seen her. The visit started in the second week. Dante would appear at odd hours, always impeccably dressed, always with some excuse. He needed to check on Cerberus's progress. He wanted to discuss the dog's training regimen. He thought Elena should have his personal number in case of emergency. Each visit lasted longer than the last. 10 minutes became 20. 20 became an hour. They'd stand in her small kitchen, Elena making coffee on the expensive machine she'd stopped protesting about. Dante leaning against her counter like he belonged there, and they'd talk about everything and nothing. About Cerberus's recovery, yes, but also about her work at the clinic, about his work which he described vaguely as import-export, about the city and books and the kind of movies that made you think. He never touched her, never stood too close, never said anything that crossed the line into inappropriate. But the tension was always there, crackling in the air between them like static electricity, building with each meeting until Elena wasn't sure if she wanted him to leave or wanted him to stay, wanted him closer or wanted to run as far away as possible. It was during the third week that things shifted. Elena was working a late shift at the clinic when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Miss Martinez, Dante's voice, but different, tighter, controlled in a way that suggested he was holding back something volatile. I need you to do something for me. What's wrong? Elena asked immediately, her clinical instincts kicking in. Is it Cerberus? No, Cerberus is fine. This is about you. A pause. There's a car outside your clinic, black sedan. My driver will take you home. Don't argue, don't ask questions, just get in the car. Now. The line went dead. Elena stood there, phone in hand, trying to process what had just happened. Through the clinic window, she could see the sedan, exactly as described. She should ignore it, she should call the police, or her supervisor, or literally anyone else. Instead, she found herself grabbing her bag, telling the receptionist she was feeling sick, and walking out to where the driver was already holding the door open. The ride took 20 minutes, but instead of heading toward her apartment, they drove into a part of the city Elena rarely visited. Old industrial buildings converted into high-end lofts, the kind of neighborhood where you needed a key card to get past the lobby. The sedan stopped in front of one such building, and the driver opened her door. Penthouse, he said. Mr. Caruso is waiting. Elena should have refused, should have demanded to be taken home. But Dante's voice on the phone had held something she'd never heard from him before. Concern. And she found, to her surprise, that she trusted it. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse, and Elena stepped into a space that was somehow exactly what she'd expected, and nothing like it at all. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Minimalist furniture that probably cost more than her annual salary. Art on the walls that she recognized from her college art history classes, originals that should have been in museums. And in the middle of it all, Dante Caruso, jacket off, sleeves rolled up, looking more human than she'd ever seen him. Cerberus was there too, lying at Dante's feet, and the dog's tail started wagging the moment it saw Elena. She crossed to it automatically, kneeling down to run her hands over its head, checking for any signs of distress. It seemed fine, happy even. So why had Dante sounded so urgent on the phone? I apologize for the dramatics, Dante said, and Elena looked up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. But I needed you somewhere safe, and I needed it quickly. Safe from what? Elena asked, standing up. You're scaring me. Good. Dante moved to the windows, looking out at the city spread below them like a kingdom. Fear is healthy. It keeps you alive. 2 hours ago, one of my associates informed me that Preston Whitmore has taken an interest in you. The name meant nothing to Elena, and her confusion must have shown because Dante's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Preston runs the East Side operations. Drugs, mostly, some human trafficking. We have an understanding, he and I. I don't interfere with his business. He doesn't interfere with mine, and we both make money. He turned to face her. Except 3 weeks ago, Preston's people were the ones who took Cerberus, the ones who hurt him. It was a power play, a way to test my reach, see if I was getting soft. I dealt with it quietly, but apparently not quietly enough. Because now Preston knows that the woman who has my dog is just a veterinary technician with no protection, no family who'd miss her, and he's thinking that maybe taking you would send an even better message than taking Cerberus did. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. You can't be serious. I'm always serious about threats to things that belong to me, Dante said quietly. And there was something in the way he said it, the possessive weight of that statement, that made Elena's heart skip a beat. You're staying here. Tonight. And for as long as it takes me to resolve this situation. I have security that even Preston won't be stupid enough to challenge, and Cerberus will be more comfortable with you here anyway. I can't just move in with you, Elena protested, even as part of her brain was already cataloging the exits, the sight lines, the fact that Dante had positioned himself between her and the elevator. I have a job, an apartment, a life. You have a target on your back because you were kind to a dog, Dante corrected. And now there was heat in his voice, anger that wasn't directed at her, but that filled the space between them anyway. You walked into my world when you took Cerberus, and I let you stay in it because it was good for him. But that decision has consequences. And one of those consequences is that people who want to hurt me now see you as a way to do it. So, yes, Miss Martinez, you can just move in with me because the alternative is you going home to your apartment with its new locks and its security cameras and waiting to see if Preston's men are better at breaking and entering than I am at preventing it. Elena opened her mouth to argue, to protest, to maintain some illusion of control over her own life. But Cerberus chose that moment to walk over and lean against her legs, and she felt the tension in the animal's body, the alertness that suggested it sensed the danger even if it didn't understand the specifics. This dog had been hurt because of the world Dante lived in. She would not let it watch her get hurt for the same reason. Fine, she said, but this is temporary. And you're going to explain to me exactly what resolving this situation means. Dante smiled then, really smiled, and it transformed his face into something that made Elena's breath catch. I wouldn't dream of keeping secrets from you, Elena. May I call you Elena? Miss Martinez seems unnecessarily formal for a woman who's about to share my living space. You can call me Elena if you explain what you actually do, she countered and watched surprise flicker across his features. And don't tell me import, export. I'm not stupid. I know what you are. I've known since Luca mentioned your name. Dante Caruso, the architect. The man who rebuilt the organized crime infrastructure in this city after the Moretti family fell. I didn't go to the police because I knew it wouldn't help, and because Cerberus needed me more than I needed to pretend I didn't understand what I'd walked into. But if we're doing this, if I'm staying here and accepting your protection, then I want the truth. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. Dante looked at her with an intensity that made her want to step back and step forward at the same time. And when he spoke, his voice was soft and dangerous and somehow honest. I'm a criminal, he said simply. I run an organization that controls significant portions of this city's underground economy. I've killed people. I've ordered people killed. I've done things that would send me to prison for the rest of my life if they could ever be proven in court. I'm not a good man, Elena. I'm not even particularly interested in being a good man. But I'm also not Preston Whitmore. I don't deal in drugs or human misery. I don't hurt things weaker than myself for fun. And I protect what's mine with everything I have. He moved closer, close enough that Elena had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. You're mine now, he continued. Not because I'm forcing you to be, but because you chose to step into my world when you took Cerberus. That was your decision. And mine is to keep you safe from the consequences of that choice, whether you want me to or not. So yes, you're staying here. Yes, we're doing this. And yes, I'm going to resolve the Preston situation in the way I resolve all situations that threaten what belongs to me. Permanently. Elena should have been terrified, should have run, screamed, called for help. Instead, she heard herself ask, how? Dante's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. You really want to know? Yes. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, as if she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Then come with me. Let me show you exactly what kind of man you've gotten involved with. And then you can decide if you still want to stay, or if you'd rather take your chances with Preston's people. He extended his hand. Elena looked at the implicit choice it represented, at the way Cerberus was watching them both with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than any dog should. She took his hand, and felt her old life slip away like water through her fingers, replaced by something darker, more dangerous, and infinitely more compelling than anything she'd ever known. The room Dante led her to was behind a door she'd initially mistaken for a closet. It opened onto stairs that descended into what should have been the floor below, but was clearly something else entirely. A private space carved out of the building's infrastructure, soundproofed and secure, that functioned as an office, war room, and confession booth all at once. Three of Dante's men were already there, including Luca, all of them standing around a table covered in photographs, maps, and what looked like surveillance equipment. They looked up when Dante entered, their expressions shifting from professional focus to poorly concealed surprise when they saw Elena behind him. Out, Dante said simply, and the men filed past without argument, though Luca paused long enough to give Elena a look that might have been sympathy, or might have been warning. Then they were alone, and Dante was gesturing for her to come closer to the table. "This is Preston Whitmore," he said, pointing to a photograph of a man in his 50s. Say, well-dressed, unremarkable, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. He controls distribution networks for 3 major drug cartels, operates a high-end escort service that's really a front for trafficking, and has been trying to expand into my territory for the past 2 years. The situation with Cerberus was his way of testing my defenses. He expected me to retaliate immediately, publicly. When I didn't, he thought I was getting soft. "But you did retaliate," Elena said, looking at the other photographs spread across the table. Buildings, warehouses, what looked like crime scene photos, though nothing was graphic enough to make her look away. Just quietly, Dante confirmed. "I shut down 3 of his operations, cost him approximately $2 million, and made it clear that any further incursions into my business would be met with escalating responses. He should have backed off, most men would have, but Preston has always had more ambition than sense, and now he thinks that you represent an opportunity." He pulled up a new photograph, and Elena's blood went cold. It was her, leaving her clinic, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. The timestamp showed it was from this morning, before Dante had called her. "They've been watching you for 3 days," Dante continued, his voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested he was working very hard to stay calm. "Mapping your routine, identifying vulnerabilities. Tonight was supposed to be the night they moved. They had a team ready to grab you from the clinic parking lot, take you to one of Preston's safe houses, and then contact me with proof of life and a list of demands." Elena's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table, feeling the cool wood under her palms, using the physical sensation to ground herself. "How did you find out?" "Because I've had my own people watching you since the day you took Cerberus," Dante said, and there wasn't even a hint of apology in his tone. "I needed to know you were safe. I needed to know no one was using you to get to me. And when my men reported that Preston's crew was conducting surveillance, I knew exactly what he was planning." He moved around the table, standing close enough now that Elena could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell that expensive cologne that had become familiar over the past weeks. "I could kill him," Dante said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Preston Whitmore could disappear tonight, and this problem would be solved. But that would start a war I don't particularly want to fight right now. It would destabilize the entire East Side, create a power vacuum that 20 other ambitious criminals would rush to fill, and result in a lot of collateral damage, civilians caught in crossfire, police crackdowns that hurt everyone's business, chaos." "So what's the alternative?" Elena asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Dante's smile was cold and calculating. "I make it clear that you're not a vulnerability. That touching you doesn't hurt me. It ends whoever's stupid enough to try. I need to demonstrate that you're under my protection in a way that's visible enough to deter Preston, but subtle enough not to trigger open warfare. He reached past her, pulling another photograph from the stack. This one showed a restaurant, upscale, the kind of place Elena had only ever seen in magazines. Tomorrow night, Dante continued, there's a fundraiser for the mayor's re-election campaign. The entire city elite will be there, including Preston Whitmore, everyone who matters in both legitimate and illegitimate circles. I'm going to attend, and you're going to come with me as my guest. We're going to be seen together, publicly, in a context that makes it clear you're not just some random woman who stumbled into my world. You're someone I've chosen to keep close, someone who's under my explicit protection. And then, if Preston still hasn't gotten the message, I'm going to have a conversation with him that leaves no room for misinterpretation. Elena processed this, her mind racing. You want to use me as bait. I want to use you as a statement, Dante corrected. Wait, there's a difference. Bait implies you're in danger, but you won't be. I'll have 20 men in that room, half of them people Preston doesn't even know work for me. You'll be safer at that fundraiser than you've been anywhere since you picked up Cerberus. This isn't about putting you at risk. It's about eliminating the risk entirely by making it clear what the cost of touching you would be. It made a terrible kind of sense. Elena had grown up in this city, had worked in clinics that treated victims of the violence that men like Dante and Preston inflicted on each other. She understood the language of power, the importance of reputation, the way that showing weakness could be more dangerous than any bullet. But understanding it intellectually and living it were two different things. And if I say no, she asked quietly, if I tell you I don't want to be part of your world, don't want to be a statement or a demonstration or anything except a woman who made a mistake by caring too much about a hurt animal? Dante's expression softened, just slightly, just enough. Then I'd respect that. I'd still protect you because this situation is my fault as much as yours. But I'd do it from a distance. I'd have my men watching your apartment, your clinic, everywhere you go. You'd be safe, but you'd be alone. And Cerberus would have to come with me because keeping him with you would only reinforce Preston's belief that you're a vulnerability worth exploiting. The dog, which had been lying quietly near the door, lifted its head at the sound of its name. Elena looked at this animal that had somehow become the axis around which her entire life was now rotating, and felt something settle in her chest. I'll do it, she said. I'll go to the fundraiser, I'll be your statement. But after this is over, after Preston backs off, I want to go back to my life. My real life. Not this. She gestured around the room, at the photographs and maps and evidence of a world she'd never wanted to be part of. Dante looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he nodded. After this is over, you can go back. I won't stop you. But Elena? Yes? You should know that I've never let anything go once I decided it was mine. And I decided you were mine the moment I walked into your apartment and saw you standing between my men and my dog with nothing but courage and conviction. So you can go back to your old life if that's what you choose. But I'm going to be there, in the background, making sure you stay safe. And eventually, you're going to realize that the line between your world and mine isn't as clear as you think it is. That maybe were always meant to end up here, with me. And Cerberus was just the excuse fate used to make it happen. He said it with such certainty, such absolute conviction, that Elena felt something shift inside her. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that felt dangerously close to recognition. Like she was looking at a future she'd never imagined. But that was somehow inevitable. We'll see, she said, because she didn't know what else to say. Dante smiled, and it was the smile of a man who always got what he wanted. Eventually. Yes, he agreed. We will. The dress arrived the next morning, delivered in a garment bag that probably cost more than Elena's monthly rent. She unzipped it slowly, half afraid of what she'd find, and then stopped breathing entirely. It was perfect. Deep emerald green silk that would bring out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, cut in a style that was elegant without being revealing, sophisticated without being ostentatious. When she tried it on, it fit like it had been made for her body specifically, which it probably had been. Dante Caruso, she was learning, didn't do anything halfway. There were shoes, too, and jewelry, and a note in handwriting that was surprisingly elegant for a man who ran a criminal empire. Wear this tonight. Trust me. Elena wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to show up in something from her own closet, make a statement about maintaining her independence. But the truth was, nothing she owned would work for a fundraiser at the Belmont Hotel. And wearing this dress, accepting this gift, was part of the role she'd agreed to play. Just for tonight, she told herself. Just until the threat was neutralized. Then she could go back to being invisible, safe, normal. She almost believed it. Dante picked her up at 7. Elena had been expecting the car, the driver, the whole production. What she hadn't been expecting was Dante himself stepping out to open her door, looking at her in that dress with an expression that made her feel like she was the only thing in the world worth looking at. "You're beautiful," he said simply. And the way he said it, like he was stating a fact rather than offering a compliment, made her blush. "It's the dress," Elena replied, trying to deflect, but Dante shook his head. "It's you. The dress just makes it impossible to ignore." The drive to the Belmont took 15 minutes, and they spent it in comfortable silence, Dante's hand resting on the seat between them, close enough that Elena could have reached for it if she'd wanted to. She didn't. She kept her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the city passing by the window, trying to prepare herself for what was coming. The fundraiser was exactly as intimidating as she'd feared. The Belmont's ballroom had been transformed into something out of a fairy tale. All crystal chandeliers and white roses and people who looked like they'd stepped out of a fashion magazine. Elena felt the weight of their attention the moment she walked in on Dante's arm, the whispers that spread like ripples across water. Who is she? Where did she come from? Is that really Dante Caruso with a date? Dante seemed oblivious to the stares, or more likely, he was so used to being the center of attention that he didn't notice anymore. He guided her through the crowd with easy confidence, introducing her to people whose names she recognized from news reports and society pages. The mayor, a state senator, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company that Elena knew from the photographs in Dante's war room was a front for money laundering. Everyone was polite, everyone smiled, and everyone understood, without it being said, exactly what Elena's presence at Dante's side meant. She was his, under his protection, off limits. They were halfway through dinner when Preston Whitmore made his appearance. Elena felt Dante tense beside her, a subtle shift that probably no one else noticed, but that she'd become attuned to over the past weeks. She followed his gaze and saw a man in his 50s working his way across the room, all smiles and handshakes, looking every inch the legitimate businessman. "That's him?" she asked quietly, and Dante nodded. "That's him. Watch his eyes. That's where the truth lives." Preston reached their table a few minutes later, and up close, Elena could see what Dante meant. The smile was practiced, professional, but his eyes were calculating, measuring, looking for weaknesses the way a predator surveys prey. "Dante," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Good to see you. And who's this lovely lady?" "Elena Martinez," Dante replied, his voice pleasant but with an edge that suggested the pleasantries were a formality they both understood. "Elena, this is Preston Whitmore. He runs several businesses on the east side." Elena shook his hand, and his grip was just a fraction too tight, held just a second too long. Marking territory, establishing dominance. All the little power plays that men like him probably didn't even realize they were doing anymore. A pleasure, Preston said, and his eyes traveled over her in a way that made her skin crawl. Dante, you've been holding out on us. I didn't know you were seeing anyone. I don't make a habit of broadcasting my personal life, Dante replied smoothly. But Elena's become important to me. Very important. I wanted to make sure everyone understood that. The message was clear as glass. Preston's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in those calculating eyes. Understanding. And something that might have been respect or might have been resentment. Of course, he said. Well, any friend of Dante's is a friend of ours. Miss Martinez, if you ever need anything, anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out. It was a test. A way to see if Elena understood the game being played, if she knew enough to recognize a threat wrapped in courtesy. She'd grown up in this city. She'd treated enough victims of men like Preston to understand exactly what he was offering and what it would cost. That's very kind, Elena said, her voice steady. But I have everything I need. Dante takes excellent care of what belongs to him. She said it deliberately, claiming the label before Preston could use it as a weapon, and she saw the flicker of surprise cross his face. This wasn't the scared civilian he'd expected. This was someone who understood the language, who knew the rules. I'm sure he does, Preston replied after a beat. Well, enjoy your evening. Dante, we should have lunch sometime. Catch up on business. I'll have Luca call your office, Dante said, which they all knew meant never. Preston nodded and moved away, and Elena felt the tension drain from Dante's shoulders. Under the table, his hand found hers, squeezed once, a silent acknowledgement of what she'd just done. That was perfect, he murmured. You're a natural at this. I shouldn't be, Elena replied, and there was an edge of something in her voice. Not quite regret, but close. This isn't who I'm supposed to be. Maybe not, Dante agreed, but it's who you are right now, and you're magnificent at it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of champagne and small talk and carefully choreographed social performances. Dante never left her side, his hand at the small of her back or his arm around her waist. Small touches that reinforced the message. She was his, and everyone needed to understand what that meant. By the time they left, Elena's feet hurt from the unfamiliar heels, and her face ached from holding a smile for hours. But she'd survived. More than survived. She'd played the part perfectly, and from the way Dante was looking at her, he knew it. The car ride back was quiet. Elena leaned her head against the window, watching the city lights blur past, and felt the weight of the evening settling onto her shoulders. She'd crossed another line tonight, stepped further into Dante's world, claimed a place at his side in a way that would have consequences she couldn't yet predict. Preston will back off now, Dante said, breaking the silence. He saw what he needed to see. You're not a vulnerability he can exploit. You're someone powerful enough to stand beside me in public, confident enough to hold your own with people who've been playing these games their entire lives. Touching you would be a declaration of war, and he's not ready for that fight. So I'm safe, Elena said. You're safe. And I can go back to my life. Dante was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. You can. I made you a promise, and I'll keep it. But Elena, I need you to understand something. What happened tonight, the way you handled yourself, the way you fit into my world like you were made for it, that's not something I can unsee. That's not something I can let go of easily. Elena turned to look at him, and in the dim light of the car, his face was all angles and shadows. What are you saying? I'm saying that I was wrong, Dante replied. When I told you that you could go back to your old life, I thought it was true. I thought I could let you walk away, but I can't. I won't. You've become too important. And not just because of Cerberus. You've become important to me in ways I didn't expect and don't fully understand. So yes, you're safe from Preston, but you're not safe from me. Because I'm going to do everything in my power to convince you to stay, to choose this life, to choose me. And I should probably apologize for that, but I'm not going to. Because I'm not a good man, Elena. I've never pretended to be. And good men don't keep things they want. But I do. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She should have been angry, should have demanded to be taken home immediately, should have reminded Dante that she was a person, not a possession, and that he didn't get to decide her future. Instead, she heard herself ask, "Why me?" Dante's smile was soft and dangerous and somehow sad. "Because you walked into a dark alley to save something everyone else had written off as damaged beyond repair. Because you looked at my men and their guns and decided a hurt animal was worth more than your safety. Because when I walked into your apartment expecting a thief or a fool, I found someone brave enough to tell me I'd failed to protect something that depended on me. You saw my worst failure, and instead of judging me for it, you fixed it. How am I supposed to let that go?" They'd arrived at the penthouse. The driver opened the door, but neither of them moved. They sat there, looking at each other across the leather seat, and Elena felt the weight of a decision settling onto her shoulders. She could walk away. Dante would let her, eventually. His obsession would fade, or he'd find someone else to focus on, and she could go back to her quiet life of work and routine and safety. Or she could stay. She could step fully into this dangerous world, accept Dante's protection and his attention, and whatever complicated feelings were building between them, and see where it led. It should have been an easy choice, the safe choice, the smart choice. But when Elena thought about going back to her empty apartment, to a life where no one saw her, where she was useful but never valued, never chosen, never wanted with the intensity that Dante Caruso wanted her, the safe choice felt like slow suffocation. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think about this without you watching me, without being in your space and under your protection. Give me a week. Let me go back to my apartment, to my job, to my life. And at the end of that week, I'll give you an answer." Dante looked like he wanted to argue, but after a moment, he nodded. 1 week. But Elena, understand that even if you choose to leave, I'm not going to stop caring about your safety. I'm not going to stop making sure you're protected. That's not something I can turn off. "I know," Elena replied, "and that's part of what I need to think about. Whether I can live with being something you feel responsible for, or if I need to be something more." She got out of the car before he could respond, before she could change her mind, and took the elevator down to where Luca was waiting to drive her home. Cerberus was already in the back seat, because of course Dante had known she'd want the dog with her, had probably known before she did. The drive back to her apartment was silent. Luca didn't try to make conversation, didn't offer advice or warnings. He just drove, and when they arrived, he walked her to her door, checked her apartment to make sure it was secure, and left without a word. Elena stood in her small, quiet apartment with Cerberus at her feet and felt the weight of the past weeks crash over her like a wave. She'd saved a dog. That was all. She'd done what any decent person would do when confronted with suffering. And somehow that simple act of kindness had pulled her into a world of violence and power and dangerous men who collected people the way other men collected art. Cerberus nudged her hand with his nose, and Elena looked down at the dog that had started all of this. The scars were still visible under his sleek coat, but they were healing. In another few weeks, they'd fade to thin white lines, barely noticeable. The psychological scars would take longer, but those were healing too. She'd seen the change in him, the way he was slowly learning to trust again, to believe that not every hand would hurt him. "What do you think?" she asked the dog. Should I go back? Should I stay? Cerberus tilted his head, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved, then walked over to the couch and jumped up, claiming his usual spot. The message was clear. He'd already decided where home was. Elena laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine amusement. You're not helpful, you know that? But maybe that was the answer she needed. Not logical arguments or careful weighing of pros and cons, but the simple truth of where she felt at home. And the uncomfortable reality was that over the past weeks, she'd felt more at home in Dante Caruso's penthouse, more seen and valued and alive than she had in years of living in this apartment. The question wasn't whether she was safer in her old life. The question was whether safety was worth the cost of invisibility. Elena had a week to decide. She had a feeling she already knew what her answer would be. The week passed slowly. Elena went to work, treated animals, came home to her quiet apartment, and tried to pretend everything was normal. But normal had shifted, had become something she couldn't quite fit into anymore. Her coworkers noticed the change, asked questions about the expensive dress she'd been photographed wearing at the mayor's fundraiser, about the rumors connecting her to Dante Caruso. She deflected, made jokes, and felt the distance between her old life and her new reality growing wider with each passing day. Dante kept his promise. He didn't call, didn't visit, didn't send gifts or messages. But Elena knew he was still watching. She'd catch glimpses of familiar faces in unfamiliar places, the men Dante had assigned to protect her maintaining a discreet distance. She should have been angry about the surveillance, but instead she felt strangely comforted. Even absent, he was keeping her safe. Cerberus was the constant. The dog followed her everywhere, sleeping at the foot of her bed, lying beside her on the couch, watching her with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. On the fourth day, Elena took him to the clinic, thinking maybe a change of scenery would help her clear her head. It was Dr. Morrison, the senior veterinarian, who finally said what everyone was thinking. Elena, you've been distracted all week. Is everything all right? They were between appointments, standing in the small break room that smelled like coffee and disinfectant. Elena looked at this woman who'd been her mentor for 3 years, who'd taught her everything she knew about veterinary medicine, and wondered how to explain that she'd accidentally stumbled into a world where the rules she'd always lived by no longer applied. I met someone, she said finally, because it was the simplest version of the truth. Dr. Morrison smiled. That's wonderful. Anyone I know? Probably not. He's complicated. The good ones usually are. Dr. Morrison poured herself a cup of coffee, added cream and sugar with the precise measurements of someone who'd been doing it the same way for decades. Can I give you some advice, even though you didn't ask for it? Elena nodded, grateful for any guidance in navigating this impossible situation. When I was your age, Dr. Morrison began, I was engaged to a very nice man. Accountant, stable, predictable. Everyone told me I was lucky, that I should be grateful, that nice, stable men don't come along every day. And they were right. He was nice, he was stable, and I was absolutely miserable. She took a sip of coffee, her eyes distant with memory. I broke off the engagement 6 weeks before the wedding. My family was horrified. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. But I knew, deep in my bones, that if I married that man, I'd spend the rest of my life being safe and comfortable and slowly dying inside. So I took a leap. I applied for a veterinary position in Alaska, of all places, working with sled dogs. Spent 2 years in a cabin with no running water, treating animals in conditions that would make this clinic look like a luxury resort. It was hard and scary and uncertain, and it was the best decision I ever made. Met my husband up there, another vet. He died 5 years ago, but those 30 years we had together were worth every risk. She looked at Elena directly, her gaze sharp and assessing. What I'm saying is, safe isn't always better. And sometimes the complicated choice is the right one, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else. Trust your instincts, Elena. They brought you this far. The words stayed with Elena for the rest of the week, echoing in her head as she went through the motions of her normal life. Trust your instincts. But her instincts were the things that had led her to step between armed men and an injured dog, that had made her open her door to Dante Caruso instead of calling the police, that whispered to her late at night that going back to her old life would feel like a kind of death. On the seventh day, Elena made her decision. She called the number Dante had given her, the one she'd saved in her phone but never used. He answered on the first ring. Elena. Just her name, but the way he said it, like he'd been waiting for this call, like he'd known it was coming, made her heart skip a beat. I've made my decision, she said, or tell me. Elena took a breath, feeling the weight of this moment, the irrevocability of what she was about to say. I'll stay. I'll try this, whatever this is, but I have conditions. Name them. I keep my job at the clinic. I need that. I need something that's mine, that exists outside of your world. Agreed. You don't lie to me, ever. I'd rather know an ugly truth than live with a beautiful lie. Agreed. And if I ever want to leave, really leave, you let me go. No arguments, no trying to convince me otherwise, no using Cerberus as leverage. You let me go. There was a pause. When Dante spoke again, his voice was rough. That's the hardest thing you could ask me. But yes, if you truly want to leave, I'll let you go. I won't like it. I won't stop caring about your safety. But I won't hold you against your will. Elena felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Then I'm in. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you, and I'm terrified, but I'm also more certain of this than I've been of anything in a long time. I'm on my way, Dante said, and the line went dead. He arrived 20 minutes later, and this time when he walked into her apartment, everything was different. This wasn't a crime boss checking on his property. This was a man coming to claim something he'd wanted from the moment he first saw it. And Elena met him halfway. They didn't speak. There wasn't anything that needed to be said. Dante crossed the room in 3 strides, and Elena stepped into his arms, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like she'd expected, and exactly what she needed. Not gentle, not careful, but intense and claiming and full of all the things they'd both been holding back for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers. I promise you, he said quietly, I will do everything in my power to make sure you never regret this choice. I know, Elena replied. That's what scares me, because you're very good at getting what you want. Dante laughed, and it was the most genuine sound she'd ever heard from him. You have no idea. The transition happened faster than Elena expected. Within a week, most of her belongings had been moved to Dante's penthouse. Not all of them, she'd insisted on keeping her apartment as a retreat, a space that was entirely hers, but enough that the penthouse started to feel like home. Dante was different behind closed doors. Still intense, still commanding, but there was a gentleness to him that she suspected very few people ever saw. He'd make her coffee in the morning, remembered how she liked it without asking. He'd call during the day just to check in, not because he was monitoring her, but because he genuinely wanted to know how she was doing. And at night, when they'd sit together on the couch with Cerberus sprawled across their feet, he'd tell her stories about his life, his childhood, the choices that had led him to become the man he was. Not all of it was easy to hear. Dante didn't sugarcoat the violence of his world, didn't pretend he was anything other than what he was. But he was honest. And that honesty built a foundation of trust that Elena knew was rare in his world. They'd been together for 3 weeks when the call came. It was late, past midnight, and Elena was already in bed when she heard Dante's phone ring. She watched him answer it, saw his expression shift from relaxed to focused in the space of a heartbeat. "Where?" he asked, his voice clipped. A pause while he listened. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Have Luca meet me." He hung up and turned to Elena, and she saw something in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Not anger, not concern, but a cold calculation that reminded her exactly who she'd chosen to be with. "I have to go," he said. "There's a situation that requires my attention." Elena sat up. "What kind of situation?" Kind of. Dante hesitated, clearly weighing how much to tell her. Then he sighed, and she saw the moment he decided to honor his promise about honesty. "Preston Whitmore made a move against one of my operations, tried to take over a shipping route I control. 3 of my men were hurt. He's forcing my hand, trying to provoke a response, and he's going to get one." The implication was clear. Dante was going to war, and people were going to get hurt, maybe die. Elena should have been horrified, should have begged him not to go, or at least to find a peaceful solution. But she'd grown up in this city. She knew how men like Preston operated, knew that showing weakness would only invite more aggression. "Be careful," she said instead. Dante looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're not going to try to stop me." "Would it work if I did?" "No." "Then why waste both our time?" Elena reached for his hand, squeezed it once. "I chose this, remember? I chose you and that. Means accepting all of you, even the parts that scare me. Just come back in one piece. Please." Dante pulled her close, kissed her hard enough to leave her breathless, then headed for the door. But before he left, he turned back. "Luca will be here in 5 minutes. He's staying with you until this is resolved. Don't argue." Elena nodded. She wouldn't argue, because she understood now, in a way she hadn't before, what it meant to be important to Dante Caruso. It meant being protected with the same intensity he applied to everything else. It meant accepting that her safety was non-negotiable, even if she didn't always agree with the methods. Luca arrived exactly 5 minutes later, taking up a position in the living room with a laptop and a phone and the kind of alertness that suggested he could go from relaxed to lethal in the space of a heartbeat. Cerberus, who'd been sleeping at the foot of the bed, came out to investigate, tail wagging when he recognized Luca. "He'll be fine," Luca said without looking up from his laptop. "Dante's very good at what he does." "What exactly does he do?" Elena asked, even though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Luca glanced at her, then back at his screen. "Tonight, he's going to have a conversation with Preston Whitmore. A very final conversation. And then the East Side is going to need a new boss, and Dante's going to make sure it's someone who understands the value of cooperation." "He's going to kill him," Elena said quietly. "He's going to eliminate a threat," Luca corrected. "Preston had multiple chances to back off. He chose escalation. This is the consequence of that choice." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to say that there had to be another way. But the truth was, she didn't know if there was. She'd seen what Preston was capable of, had felt the predatory way he looked at her, had understood instinctively that he saw people as tools or obstacles, nothing more. The world was probably better off without him in it. That didn't make it easier to accept that the man she was falling in love with was the one who'd make that happen. The night stretched on. Elena couldn't sleep. She sat on the couch with Cerberus's head in her lap, one hand absently stroking the dog's ears while her mind raced. Luca worked quietly, occasionally taking phone calls in Italian that she couldn't follow, but that seemed to be updates on the situation. It was almost 4 in the morning when Dante finally came back. Elena heard the elevator, the sound of his footsteps, and then he was there, jacket off, tie loosened, looking exhausted but unharmed. "It's done," he said simply. Elena stood, crossed to him, and wrapped her arms around his waist. She didn't ask for details, didn't ask if he'd been the one to pull the trigger or if he'd delegated that task. Just held him and felt him relax against her, some of the tension draining from his body. "Thank you," he murmured into her hair. "For what?" "For not asking questions you don't want the answers to. For trusting me to do what needed to be done. For being here when I came back." Elena pulled back enough to look at him. "I meant what I said. I chose this. All of it. The good parts and the hard parts and everything in between. That doesn't mean I'm always going to like what you have to do, but it means I understand why you do it, and I'm not going to judge you for being who you are." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not," Elena agreed, and was rewarded with a surprised laugh. "But you've got me anyway, so we'll just have to figure out how to make this work." They went to bed as the sun was starting to rise, Cerberus taking his usual spot at the foot of the bed, Dante pulling Elena close. And for the first time since this whole complicated situation started, Elena felt like maybe, just maybe, they were going to be okay. The aftermath of Preston's death rippled through the city's underworld like an earthquake. Dante consolidated control over the East Side operations, installing people he trusted in key positions, restructuring the whole network to eliminate the worst of Preston's enterprises, the trafficking, the most violent drug distribution. "It wasn't altruism," he explained to Elena. "It was good business. Dead customers and federal investigations were bad for everyone's bottom line." Elena watched it all from the inside, learning the language of power and violence and compromise that governed Dante's world. She didn't participate, kept her hands clean, but she was present. She sat in on meetings where decisions were made, learned the names and faces of the people who mattered, understood the delicate balance of alliances that kept the peace. And slowly, almost without realizing it, she became a fixture. Not just Dante's woman, though she was that too, but a presence in her own right. People learned that she could be trusted with information, that her word was reliable, that she had influence with Dante that went beyond the physical. It was strange. Elena had spent most of her life being invisible, and now she was anything but. People noticed when she entered a room, acknowledged her opinion, treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the fact that she'd proven herself capable of navigating this dangerous world with grace. 6 months after she'd made the decision to stay, Elena found herself in Dante's study, looking at the photographs that still covered the war room table. Different faces now, different operations, but the same careful planning, the same meticulous attention to detail. Dante came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. Elena thought about it, really thought about it. Her life had changed in ways she never could have predicted. She still worked at the clinic, still treated animals, still had that piece of herself that existed outside Dante's world. But she also lived in a penthouse, had access to resources she'd never dreamed of, and was in a relationship with a man who'd literally killed to keep her safe. "No," she said finally. "No regrets. This isn't the life I planned for, but it's the life that found me. And I'm happy. Genuinely happy. Does that make me a terrible person?" "It makes you honest," Dante replied. "And brave. And mine." Elena turned in his arms, looking up at him. "I love you, you know. I probably shouldn't, given everything, but I do." It was the first time either of them had said it. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful at the same time. Dante's expression softened into something that looked almost like wonder. "I love you too. Have from the moment you told me I'd failed to protect Cerberus and demanded I do better. You saw the worst of me and didn't flinch. How could I not love that?" They kissed, slow and sweet, and Cerberus, who'd been sleeping in the corner, made a sound that was almost like approval. Looking back later, Elena would identify this as the moment everything truly changed. Not when she took the dog, not when she agreed to stay, but this moment, when they acknowledged what had been building between them for months, when they chose each other not out of necessity or circumstance, but out of genuine love. The future was uncertain. Dante's world was dangerous, and there would be more threats, more violence, more nights when she'd have to wait and worry and hope he came back in one piece. But there would also be mornings waking up next to him, evenings sitting together with a dog that had brought them together, moments of quiet joy in the middle of chaos. Elena had learned something in the months since she'd found a battered Doberman in an alley. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept the life you weren't planning for. Sometimes love means choosing someone, despite the risks, or maybe because of them. And sometimes the things that seem like mistakes turn out to be the best decisions you ever made. She'd saved a dog. And in doing so, she'd saved herself, given herself permission to be seen, to be valued, to be loved with an intensity that most people never experienced. Looking at Dante now, seeing the way he looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world, Elena understood that she'd never go back. Her old life, safe and quiet and invisible, held no appeal anymore. She'd tasted something richer, more complex, more real, and there was no returning from that. "Come on," Dante said, taking her hand. "Let's take Cerberus for a walk. I want to show you something." They took the elevator down to street level, Cerberus on a leash, and walked through the neighborhood as the sun set. People recognized Dante, gave him respectful nods, wide berth, but no one approached. They walked for 20 minutes until they reached a small park that Elena had never noticed before. Dante led her to a bench, and they sat, watching Cerberus explore the grass with the cautious enthusiasm of a dog who'd learned that the world could be good but never forgot it could be cruel. "I bought this park," Dante said conversationally. 3 weeks ago. It was going to be torn down, turned into condos. I bought it through a shell corporation and donated it to the city with very specific restrictions on its use. It has to remain a public park in perpetuity. No development allowed." Elena looked at him in surprise. "Why?" "Because this is where I was sitting when Luca called to tell me you'd been photographed at the clinic with Cerberus. This is where I made the decision to come to your apartment instead of sending someone else. And I thought, given how much that decision changed my life, the place deserved to be protected." He said it simply, like it was the most natural thing in the world to buy a park because it was the location of a pivotal moment. And maybe, in his world, it was. "You're ridiculous," Elena said, but she was smiling. "I'm in love," Dante corrected, "and I have more money than I know what to do with. So occasionally I do ridiculous things to commemorate the moments that matter." They sat there as the light faded, watching their dog, their impossible dog that had brought them together, and Elena felt a peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. This was home. Not the penthouse, not her old apartment, but this. Sitting beside Dante Caruso in a park he'd bought for sentimental reasons, with a dog named after a mythological monster, living a life she'd never planned for and couldn't imagine giving up. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being exactly who you are. For not pretending to be someone safer or easier. For choosing me." Dante turned to her, and in the fading light, his eyes were soft. "Always," he promised, "I'll always choose you." And Elena believed him, because Dante Caruso might be a criminal, might be dangerous, might be everything her rational mind said she should run from. But he was also the man who'd protected her when she needed it, who'd given her space when she asked for it, who'd been honest even when the truth was ugly, and who'd shown her that love didn't always come in safe, predictable packages. Sometimes it came with sharp edges and dark histories and a Doberman named Cerberus. And sometimes that was exactly what you needed. Before we end this story, if you've made it this far and you're feeling everything Elena felt, that mix of fear and exhilaration and recognition, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about Elena's choice. Would you have done the same? Would you have walked away? I want to know. And if you really want to support this channel and help us create more content that keeps you glued to your screen, there's a link in the description where you can buy us a cup of coffee. Every contribution helps us bring you better stories, better production, better everything. Now let me tell you how this story ends. A year after Elena first found Cerberus in that rain-soaked alley, she and Dante got married. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, which in Dante's case meant the people he trusted not to kill him, held in the same park he'd bought because it mattered to their story. Cerberus was the ring bearer, because of course he was. Elena wore a simple white dress that Dante had somehow known was exactly what she'd want without asking. Dante wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's cars. And when they said their vows, promising to love each other through whatever dangerous, complicated, beautiful life they were building together, there wasn't a dry eye in the small gathering. Well, except for Luca, who maintained he had allergies. Elena kept her job at the clinic, kept her apartment, though she rarely stayed there anymore, kept the parts of herself that existed outside of Dante's world, because that balance was what made their relationship work. She wasn't consumed by his life. She participated in it while maintaining her own identity, her own purpose. And Dante supported that, encouraged it even, because he'd fallen in love with a woman who'd stepped between armed men and an injured animal with nothing but courage, and he was smart enough to know that the qualities that made her capable of that couldn't be locked away or diminished. They had fights, of course, relationships built on intensity and danger, and two strong-willed people rarely go smoothly. But they also had moments of joy, of laughter, of quiet contentment that neither of them had expected to find. Cerberus lived for another 8 years, long enough to see Elena and Dante's first child born, long enough to transition from guard dog to gentle giant, who'd let a toddler use him as a pillow. When he finally passed, old and comfortable and surrounded by the people who loved him, both Elena and Dante wept. They buried him in the park, the one Dante had bought under a tree with a plaque that read, Cerberus. He brought us together. We'll love him forever. It was illegal, probably, but Dante owned the park, and no one was going to tell him what he could or couldn't do with his own property. Years later, when people would ask Elena how she'd ended up married to one of the most powerful men in the city's underworld, she'd tell them the truth. She'd found a dog in an alley. Everything else had followed from that single act of compassion. And if they pressed, if they asked whether she ever regretted the choice, whether she wished she'd walked away from Dante and his dangerous world and the complicated life they'd built together, her answer was always the same. Not once, not even for a second, I saved a dog and he saved me right back. Everything else was just details. Because that was the truth. Elena Martinez had spent most of her life being invisible, useful but unseen, valuable for what she could do rather than who she was. And then she'd stepped into a dark alley to help something that was suffering. And that choice had led her to a man who saw her, really saw her, and decided she was worth everything. Their love story wasn't conventional, it wasn't safe, it wasn't what anyone would have predicted or what most people would have chosen, but it was real, and it was theirs. And it had started with a simple act of mercy toward a creature no one else wanted to save. Sometimes that's how the best stories begin. Not with grand gestures or careful planning, but with a moment of kindness in a dark alley. A decision to help when walking away would be easier. a choice to see the potential in something everyone else has written off. Elena had seen that potential in Cerberus, and Dante had seen it in her, and together they'd built something that defied every expectation, exceeded every limit, and proved that love, real love, doesn't always follow the rules. It just is. Messy and complicated and dangerous and absolutely perfect. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.